What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about my must-start and my must-sit players at the wide receiver and the running back position as we head into Week 7 of the fantasy football season. As always, we'll talk about two players at each position. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe to this channel. That way you don't miss any of our future videos. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video. And let's start with my must-start wide receivers. So the first player I want to talk about in today's video is going to be Diontae Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. Now, he gets a matchup this week at the Washington Commanders. And last week, Diontae Johnson, he caught 6 of his 10 targets for 78 yards and a touchdown in the Panthers' loss to the Atlanta Falcons. Now, the matchup this week against Washington, it's everything we could have hoped for. Washington's secondary continues giving up big day after big day to fantasy football wide receivers every week, and they're currently ranked 29th against the position. Not to mention the game script in this one heavily favors Diontae Johnson with the 51.5 point projected game total and the Panthers being 8-point underdogs, meaning lots of points and lots of passing opportunities for the Panthers to try and play keep up in this game. Also, Diontae Johnson has seen 11 red zone targets so far this year, which is the second most in the NFL, meaning he's seeing plenty of scoring opportunities with Andy Dalton under center. So with the level of play we've seen out of Diontae Johnson so far this year and the perfect matchup this week against the Washington Commanders, I would be plugging Diontae into my lineups as a low-end wide receiver 1 here in Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Now, moving on to my next must-start wide receiver, I want to talk about T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. He plays a game this week at the Cleveland Browns, and T. Higgins, he caught all 7 of his targets for 77 receiving yards in Sunday's win over the New York Giants. Now, this matchup this week isn't projected to be the highest scoring game, but Cleveland has been pretty bad against fantasy football wide receivers, currently ranking 25th against the position. Ever since coming back from his early season hamstring injury, Higgins has been heavily involved in the Bengals offense, currently holding a 28.5% target share in the offense, which is more than Jamar Chase in this Bengals offense so far. Now, we've seen Higgins have the big games like he did back in Week 5 against the Ravens, especially when he gets into the end zone, and I'd continue to keep riding the hot hand with Higgins in fantasy, who led the team in targets and receptions last week. That said, I would be throwing T. Higgins into my lineups this week as a safe wide receiver 2 play with some upside in a good Bengals offense against a bad Browns defense. Now, let's move over to my must-start running backs. I want to talk about J.K. Dobbins of the Los Angeles Chargers. He gets to play a game on the road at the Arizona Cardinals, and J.K. Dobbins, he carried the ball 25 times for 96 yards and a touchdown in the 23-16 win over the Broncos on Sunday. He also caught both of his targets for 6 yards in that one as well. Arizona currently ranks 25th against the position, giving up an average of 24 fantasy points per game, and with Los Angeles wanting to rely on the run game as their identity this year with Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh, I expect them to keep feeding Dobbins the ball. Now, Dobbins, he has been great this season, posting 3 RB1 performances in his first 5 games played, and the 2 games where he didn't finish as an RB1 were in their 2 losses against Kansas City and Pittsburgh. It's very clear that J.K. Dobbins is a smash play at the running back position in the right matchups this year, and this is one of those games to me. Not to mention he also has some touchdown upside every week with a touchdown in 3 of his last 5 starts for the Chargers. I strongly suggest throwing J.K. Dobbins into your lineups where you have him, and if you do decide to play him here this week, I would be looking at him as a low-end running back 1. And now moving to my other must-start at the running back position, let's talk about Brian Robinson Jr. for the Washington Commanders. Now, they play a game this week against the Carolina Panthers, and Brian Robinson Jr. missed last week's game versus the Baltimore Ravens due to a knee injury, so obviously this start of the week label is contingent on him going into this week's matchup healthy. However, this matchup against the Carolina Panthers is way too good to pass up in my opinion. Carolina currently ranks dead last against the running back position and is giving up 32.9 fantasy points per game to the position as a whole. Not to mention the game total is a projected 51.5 points, with the Commanders being 8-point favorites, meaning there's going to be plenty of rushing attempts for Robinson late in the game as the Commanders hang on to a lead. Robinson has been on fire to start the year, posting an RB2 or better finish in every single game, and with this cupcake matchup in Week 7, he needs to be put into starting lineups if he's healthy, because he's going to have a ton of upside here this week. I would be throwing him into my lineup in all types of formats, and if you do, this is a guy who I believe will finish as a running back 1 here in Week 7. But now that we've talked about my must-starts, let's talk about my must-sit players, or players that I would be nervous about putting into my lineup here this week. Let's start at the wide receiver position, and a player that I'm considering sitting is going to be Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, he plays a game this week against the Kansas City Chiefs, and last week Aiyuk, he caught 2 of his 4 targets for 37 receiving yards against the Seattle Seahawks. Aiyuk has struggled to get it rolling this year, and this week's matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs is going to be tough, as Kansas City has a habit of removing the wide receiver 1 on opposing offenses from the game plan completely, and they currently rank 7th against the wide receiver position, allowing just 22.7 fantasy points per game to the position as a whole. Now, we have a decent sample size of production from Aiyuk, with 5 of his first 6 games being bust performances for fantasy football teams, and only 1 of the 6 games being worthy of a starting spot in your fantasy football lineups. And I get with the Niners, it's going to be hard to predict with any of their stars who is going to have a big game each and every week, but Aiyuk's floor seems lower than the others at the moment, and this matchup is just difficult in general. I understand if you feel like you have to play Brandon Aiyuk, but if I'm playing him in my fantasy football leagues this week, I am only going to be looking at him as a wide receiver 3 in my rankings here this week. Now, moving on to my next wide receiver, I want to talk about George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He plays against the New York Jets here this week, and last week Pickens caught 3 receptions on 8 targets for 53 yards in Sunday's 32-13 win over the Raiders. We've been talking about how Justin Fields is capping the receiving upside of George Pickens despite helping the Steelers win games due to his low volume of passing stats every single week, but it does look like the Steelers are trending to make a switch to Russell Wilson at the quarterback position here this week. Now, the issue with this is that although Wilson is going to be better for Pickens in fantasy, this week's matchup against the Jets is going to be really tough for Pickens, who is likely going to be spending the majority of his day shadowed by Sauce Gardner. Not to mention, this game also has a very low projected game total at just 38 points, meaning the sportsbooks aren't projecting lots of scoring opportunities for either team. Now, there's a chance that Pickens catches some big plays, with Russell Wilson hopefully being able to work deep downfield better than Justin Fields has in weeks past, but the uncertainty of the offensive change and a tough matchup versus the Jets defense makes me nervous for Pickens here in week 7. So if you need to play George Pickens this week, I guess that's okay, but I would really only be looking at him as a flex play here this week versus the Jets. Now, moving over to my must-sit running backs, I'm going to kick it off with Bucky Irving of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He gets a matchup this week against the Baltimore Ravens, and Bucky is actually coming off of his best game of the season so far, posting 14 carries for 81 yards and a touchdown, with 2 receptions for another 24 yards receiving. However, this week's matchup feels much tougher versus the Baltimore Ravens, who currently rank 4th best against fantasy football running backs. It's worth noting that last week's performance came with Rachaad White off the field and against a softer Saints defensive front, and we still don't have any clear indication as to if Rachaad White will be back in the lineup for this game, but Bucky feels like people are just getting a little too high on the hype of Bucky Irving. Now, this game does have a 49.5 point projected game total, so the way in which I think Bucky can perform enough for fantasy football teams would be by catching a lot of footballs in the receiving game if White is out, but there's just too many what ifs in this situation at the moment. I would be looking at other options this week if I had them, but I understand that with bye weeks and injuries, you still may be forced to throw Bucky into some lineups, and if that is the case for you, I would only be looking at Bucky Irving as a running back 3 type of play against a very scary Baltimore Ravens defense. And now my final must-sit running back of today's video is going to be Nick Chubb of the Cleveland Browns. He plays against the Cincinnati Bengals this week, and Nick Chubb is scheduled to make his season debut against the Cincinnati Bengals here this week, and it's easy to get caught up in the narrative and want to root for Chubb's comeback. Hell, I even got caught up in the narrative myself earlier this week, but we need to remind ourselves that there is a significant chance that the Browns and head coach Kevin Stefanski monitored Chubb's workload this week, making sure not to put too much work on his plate here in his first game back. Additionally, the Browns are banged up on the offensive line, and they haven't really been a good offense all year long, making it harder to get Chubb the ball, as they will likely be playing from a negative game script for the majority of the day. The game total in this one is only 41.5 points, with the Browns as 6-point underdogs, also meaning that Chubb, who doesn't profile as a good pass catcher, could lose some of the limited work he does get to Pierre Strong as they look for a receiving back to play from behind. I'm rooting for Nick Chubb, and I want him to succeed, and I truly hope that he comes out and defies the odds and does make me look stupid for this take here this week, performing very well against the Cincinnati Bengals, but there's just a lot of risk in this start this week, and he's a player that I think I'm just going to leave on my bench. So there you have it, folks. That is my must start and my must sit wide receivers and running backs here as we head into week 7. As always, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss any future content. If you liked today's video and you found something actionable in it, make sure you hit that like button and go join our free Discord. Our Discord is linked in the description, and as I said, it's free to join, so there is no risk in doing that. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.